It's hard to find words to describe the horror of the war in Ukraine at the moment, and there's no doubt that this shocking invasion has led a strong desire amongst Irish people to help in any way that we can. And I think that's also because of the fact that the history of Ireland and the history of Ukraine have many parallels, being lodged right up against a big colonial power, suffered from enormous and devastating famines because of the decisions of that colonial power, and then aggressive wars being waged against the smaller country by that colonial power too. There's no doubt that we cannot afford to stand idly by, and we should be as active as we can in terms of supporting in a humanitarian sense and also agitating for peace and de-escalation. Now, I find it very hard to find any evidence of this government actually agitating for de-escalation or working for de-escalation. It seems to me that in the last number of months especially, that the government have outsourced much of our foreign affairs activities now to the European Union. And indeed, when we aim to push for the governments to expel the Russian ambassador, the government's response was, we're going to wait till the rest of Europe decides to do so also. For they said that if the European Union does it as a whole, it will have more power. And that may be true. A collective decision would have more effect and influence. But collective indecision doesn't have any more power and influence. In actual fact, we could show leadership in making those decisions ourselves. And it seems quite shocking that we would outsource our sovereignty on these key issues, supposedly to help the sovereignty of the Ukraine. I think it's important that we have a leadership role in terms of the decisions that we make to help Ukraine in its time of need. And I look at countries such as Israel and as France, who their leaders picked up the phone and made an effort to talk to the leadership in Russia to de-escalate. And many might say, well, no, that's hardly going to be likely that people will listen to Ireland in this situation. But on the flip side, it's hardly likely that 100 rockets from the Curragh sent over to the Ukraine is going to change the nature of the war there. Yet we've seen many people from the government benches make arguments that Ireland should start to feed lethal weapons into that particular war. That would be a grave mistake in my view, for Ireland has a strong and proud history of neutrality. It has a proud history in terms of UN peacekeeping, in terms of anti-colonialism, in terms of fighting against nuclear weapons, and also in terms of our missionary work, where we saw missionaries leave this country for generations and go to the developing world and help build the developing world. And as a result of that strong work, we have a great reputation internationally. The Irish passport opens minds and doors everywhere we go. We have a competency, if you like, to be a country that can be seen as to help to de-escalate situations, to be able to go in and sit down and try to work with different factions to see can we bring about peace. And indeed, our own peace process here gives us expertise in that space as well. If we get involved in aligning ourselves to military blocs, there's no doubt that we would squander that reputation, that competitive advantage that we have, that competency. And that, you know, people who have studied neutrality and military blocs will tell you that military blocs often use wars to look after their own economic needs. And indeed, we've seen NATO being involved in military conflicts as a result, primarily because of their own economic needs. And small countries have very little influence in terms of directing what large military blocs do. So it is absolutely illogical to think that Ireland would have an influence over any military bloc, be it the EU or be it the NATO, in terms of how it uses its military. Yet we would have to supply the military hardware and potentially the young men and women to fight in those wars. And it was interesting that, you know, an example of our influence compared to Germany's influence is that the European Union decided to take the step towards providing military hardware to this war in the Ukraine simply on the basis that Germany made the decision to change its policy on it. As soon as Germany changed its policy, the policy was changed throughout the European Union. So we need to make sure that we focus on humanitarian aid. And There is absolutely much we can do in terms of this. We have not exhausted our ability to help and our need for that help in any ways whatsoever. And in actual fact, I believe we're only touching the tip of the iceberg in terms of this. We can save lives by the provision of medical supplies to people in the Ukraine. They need blood, they need oxygen, they need medicine, they need clothing for heat, they need tents and sleeping bags, they need materials, and we can provide far more in terms of that. And I just want to pay tributes to the role people like Laura O'Neill, our Ainto Westmeath rep, has played in terms of gathering up an enormous amount of materials to send them over to Poland to help people in Ukraine. And I also want to commend Elaine Dunn from the Federation of Childcare Providers, who right now is on the way to Poland with a truck full of medical and humanitarian material. This is the real impact that people can have in this country in terms of helping our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine as well. I want to just turn to the issue of refugees, and I note that the Taoiseach and other leaders of the government were on international media in recent times making very highbrow speeches in terms of welcoming refugees to Ireland. But I also note that at the time, I don't believe Deputy Burry is here, at the time I was getting phone calls from social welfare offices telling me, Peadar, we have people from the Ukraine coming in here, but we don't know what to do. I was getting phone calls from GP offices saying we have people from the Ukraine coming in here, but we've got no direction from the government in how to deal with them. A young Ukrainian woman rang me from Limerick. She had flown in, she had met with her friends in Dublin Airport. She was in Limerick, and as a result, she didn't know where to go to in terms of housing. And I will say that people like the Red Cross have done massive work in terms of helping refugees. But the problem I have, Minister, and this is a key point, I would like if you just maybe might pay attention to this particular point, is I believe that there needs to be an interdepartmental task force to deal with refugees that are coming into the state. For 10 years, this state has welcomed about 4,500 refugees into the state. But now, in the last 4 weeks, it is after welcoming about 15,000 refugees. So there is a need for a centralised interdepartmental cooperation to make sure all of the key stakeholders are involved and there's good communication in relation to what's happening. Right around the country, there are people like, I can think of church leaders, parish priests and community groups, civil society doing phenomenal work. But I understand from talking to them that the government is actually yet to engage with them. And I don't think that's right. I think that, do the media briefings and do the media appearances for sure, but do the background work first. Get the key elements sorted out. My worry is that, we're hearing stories about sex for rent, and I'm delighted that that's been addressed by a bill here in the Dáil. But we need to make sure that there is absolutely no space for exploitation in any space here, that there is accountability right through society with regards to what's happening. I have a fear, Minister, that what we're going to see is we're going to see Ukrainians being sent to direct provision centres at some stage in this process. We already know that in my own county, in Gormanstown, that the army is looking at tents currently to deal with the refugee crisis. And what I would like to see is that more effort is made to get vacant homes right across the state back into use in terms of housing refugees into the state. There are many old schools and convents and buildings in this country that I know in my own constituency, some in the hands of the church, some in the hands of the state, but they're empty for a long period of time. We need to be getting those buildings back into use to make sure that we can accommodate refugees. Many of the steps necessary to house the many people in search of homes already in this country are the same steps necessary to house the number of refugees. In actual fact, the work done on that would help in both of those particular problems as well. I want to pay credit to the group MECPATH for the fantastic work that they do combating human trafficking, and they have called for all frontline staff to be trained in identifying the exploitation of women and children in the context of the refugee crisis. Will the government ensure that this happens? The issue of human trafficking is something that doesn't get the adequate discussion or debate in this House that it needs. And I want to commend JP and Anne and all those in MECPATH for the constant campaigning that they do in this issue. It is an absolutely appalling situation that this state is an outlier in terms of not making, in terms of the lack of work that it does to protect people who are trafficked. And, you know, it is something that we don't see with our eyes. It's hidden from many people in society, but it's absolutely real for hundreds and hundreds of people on an annual basis in this state. I want to talk briefly about the amount of money washing around in the IFSC. You know, this is really incredible that there are billions of Russian rubles washing around the IFSC currently, looking to circumvent the sanctions that have been placed by the West on Russia. Now, we had the governor of the central bank in with us just a few minutes in the Finance Committee. And I don't want to put words in the governor's mouth, but if I can paraphrase him, he believes that there are up to 15 or 16 entities in the IFSC that have connections with sanctioned individuals or entities in Russia. And I have asked the government numerous times, will they investigate what's happening? I've asked the central bank, are they investigating what's happening? And they said, to be honest, their role is administrative. They said that they don't have a proactive role in terms of this. I've called the Gardaí Economic